Humanity's story is deeper than any history book could ever tell. If you could travel back in time, not centuries, but hundreds of thousands of years, you'd find that all roads lead to one place, Africa. But this isn't just about where humans first appeared. The real question is, why is sub-Saharan African DNA so unique? Why does it hold the richest genetic diversity on Earth? And what does that mean for the rest of us? The answer will change the way you think about your own ancestry, human evolution, and even the future of medicine. For decades, scientists have been trying to unravel the mystery of human genetic variation. But most of the studies you hear about focus on European or Asian DNA. That's like trying to understand the origins of a book by only reading the last few pages. The real story, our full genetic history, is written in Africa. Genetic research has confirmed something mind-blowing. Two people from opposite sides of Africa are more genetically different from each other than a European and an Asian. That's how deep Africa's genetic roots run. So, what makes African DNA so special? The answer lies in time. Modern humans, Homo sapiens, originated in Africa around 200,000 to 300,000 years ago. For most of human history, every single person on Earth lived there. Then, around 60,000 to 70,000 years ago, a small group of people left Africa and started spreading across the world. But here's the catch. Those early migrants took only a small fraction of Africa's genetic diversity with them. It's like taking just a few colors from a full box of crayons and trying to paint the entire world. The result? Populations outside Africa are far less genetically diverse than those who stayed behind. This is why scientists say sub-Saharan Africa is the genetic goldmine of humanity. It has preserved the full range of ancient human variation, while the rest of the world carries just a small part of that legacy. But this isn't just about ancestry. It's about survival, adaptation, and evolution. Because African DNA is so diverse, it has also given rise to some of the most fascinating genetic adaptations in human history. One of the best examples is malaria resistance. Malaria has been a deadly threat in Africa for thousands of years. In response, a mutation known as the sickle cell trait evolved. If you inherit one copy of this gene, you gain protection against malaria. But if you inherit two copies, you develop sickle cell anemia, a serious blood disorder. It's a double-edged sword, an evolutionary trade-off that shows just how powerful natural selection can be. And that's just the beginning. Take high-altitude survival. While Tibetans and Andean populations developed unique ways to adapt to life in oxygen-thin environments, Ethiopian highlanders evolved their own completely separate genetic solution. It's a different biological pathway, proving that evolution doesn't follow a single script. It rewrites itself based on where people live. Even skin color, one of the most visible traits shaped by genetics, is a direct result of human adaptation. Darker skin evolved in Africa to protect against the intense UV radiation near the equator. But not all Africans have the same skin tone. Populations living in less sunny regions of Africa have naturally evolved lighter skin to absorb more vitamin D, just like Europeans did. This proves that skin color is simply an environmental adaptation, not a marker of race or identity, but a living testament to human evolution. But here's where things get even more interesting. Some genetic traits unique to African populations are still mysteries waiting to be solved. Scientists recently discovered traces of what they call ghost populations in African DNA, evidence of ancient human groups that interbred with modern humans but left no direct descendants. It's like finding a missing chapter of human history, written into our genes instead of in books. These discoveries challenge everything we thought we knew about early human migrations and evolution. Now, you might be wondering, why does any of this matter today? The answer is simple: medicine. Right now, less than 2% of global genetic studies focus on African populations. That's a huge problem because many diseases and health conditions are influenced by genetic diversity. For example, African populations have unique genetic variants that affect blood pressure, metabolism, and even how their bodies respond to medications. By studying African DNA, scientists can develop better treatments for diseases like hypertension, diabetes, and even Alzheimer's. Projects like the African Genome Project are finally working to fill this gap. sequencing African DNA to unlock medical breakthroughs that could help not just Africans, but the entire world. The truth is, the more we understand African genetics, the more we understand what it means to be human. Sub-Saharan DNA isn't just unique. It's a living record of our shared past, our evolutionary journey, and the secrets to our survival. Understanding it doesn't just connect us to our origins. It holds the key to our future. No matter where you're from, your DNA carries a piece of this incredible story. So, the next time you think about your ancestry, remember, Africa isn't just a place on the map. It's where all of our stories began. The story of human migration is often told as a journey out of Africa. But what if the most important movements in human history weren't the ones that left the continent, but the ones that happened within it? Sub-Saharan Africa is not just the birthplace of modern humans. It is also the site of some of the most significant population movements in history. These migrations didn't just shape Africa. They influenced the entire genetic landscape of the world. For thousands of years, African populations have been on the move. But unlike the well-documented spread of humans into Europe and Asia, the movements of ancient African peoples are still being uncovered. Thanks to advancements in DNA analysis and ancient genome sequencing, scientists are finally beginning to piece together a story that was hidden for millennia. And what they've found is nothing short of extraordinary. One of the biggest revelations comes from the Khoisan people of southern Africa. Genetic studies show that the Khoisan carry some of the oldest DNA lineages in the world. Their ancestors split from all other human groups over 100,000 years ago. To put that in perspective, if you compare a Khoisan person's DNA to that of a European and an East Asian, the European and the Asian are more closely related to each other than either of them are to the Khoisan. That's how ancient their lineage is. But while the Khoisan represent a deep ancestral branch, other African groups have undergone massive genetic mixing. Take the Bantu migration, one of the most important human migrations in history. Around 3,000 to 5,000 years ago, Bantu-speaking people from West Africa began moving across the continent, spreading agriculture, ironworking, and their distinct genetic signature. Over time, they replaced or mixed with local hunter-gatherer groups, transforming the genetic makeup of Africa. Today, Bantu-descended populations make up the majority of people in Central, Eastern, and Southern Africa. But the movement of people wasn't just within Africa. It also brought outside influences into the continent. Genetic evidence shows that after early humans left Africa around 60,000 years ago, some of their descendants eventually migrated back. Yes, you heard that right. There was a reverse migration from Eurasia into Africa thousands of years later. The evidence. Many Africans today carry traces of Eurasian DNA, a sign that populations from the Middle East and Europe mixed with African groups long before recorded history. And then there's the more recent history. The tragic displacement of millions of Africans during the transatlantic slave trade. From the 16th to the 19th century, millions of people were forcibly taken from Africa to the Americas. Today, the genetic legacy of these migrations can still be seen in the DNA of African Americans, Caribbeans, and Afro-Latinos. But what's remarkable is that despite being forcibly removed from their homeland, their DNA still carries clear markers of their African ancestry, connecting them to specific regions and ethnic groups across the continent. All of these movements, ancient and recent, voluntary and forced, have shaped African DNA into one of the most complex and fascinating genetic tapestries on Earth. While much of the world's population descends from a single migration out of Africa, Africans themselves have been reshaped by countless internal migrations, adaptations, and interactions. But here's what's truly incredible. Despite all of these migrations, Africa still retains the deepest genetic diversity of any place on Earth. Even with thousands of years of movement and mixing, the genetic richness of the continent remains unmatched. That's why studying African genetics isn't just about the past. It's about unlocking the future. From tracing the origins of human disease to uncovering the secrets of evolution, African DNA holds answers that could change everything we know about humanity. The migrations of sub-Saharan Africa weren't just movements of people. They were movements of knowledge, culture, and survival. And in their DNA, the story of our species is still being written. When we think about human diversity, we often focus on differences between people across continents. But what if I told you that the biggest differences in human DNA aren't between Africans and non-Africans, but between Africans themselves? Sub-Saharan Africa isn't just the birthplace of modern humans. It is the most genetically diverse place on Earth. To understand why, we need to go back to the beginning of our species. Homo sapiens first appeared in Africa around 300,000 years ago. For most of that time, humans lived only in Africa. The first small group to leave the continent did so around 60,000 years ago. That means non-African populations, whether European, Asian, or Native American, descend from a single, small population that left Africa. But Africans, they descend from everyone who stayed. Think of it like this. If you took a random pair of Africans from opposite sides of the continent, say, a Yoruba person from Nigeria and a San person from Namibia, their DNA would be more different from each other than the DNA of a Chinese person and a Norwegian person. That's how deep the genetic diversity in Africa runs. But why does this matter? Genetic diversity isn't just about differences, it's about adaptability. The more variation a population has, the better it can adapt to environmental changes, diseases, and new challenges. This is why African populations have survived in every climate imaginable, from the scorching Sahara Desert to the humid jungles of the Congo and the high-altitude regions of Ethiopia. This diversity also explains some of the unique physical traits found across the continent. The Nilotic people of East Africa, for example, are some of the tallest and leanest humans on the planet, an adaptation to their hot climate, allowing their bodies to cool more efficiently. Meanwhile, the pygmy populations of Central Africa have evolved short stature, which helps them navigate dense rainforests. And then there's skin color. While dark skin is a well-known adaptation to intense sunlight near the equator, not all Africans have the same shade. Some populations, like the Khoisan of southern Africa, have lighter brown skin, suggesting multiple evolutionary paths to different skin tones. In fact, genetic studies have shown that some of the mutations responsible for light skin in Europeans originated in Africa tens of thousands of years ago. But the real power of African DNA lies not just in physical traits, it's in resilience. One of the most famous examples is the sickle cell trait. In regions where malaria is common, people with one copy of the sickle cell gene have natural resistance to the disease. This mutation arose independently in several African populations, showing how natural selection continuously shapes human survival. Yet, for all this genetic richness, African populations have been vastly underrepresented in genetic research. Most medical studies on human genetics are based on European populations, even though Africans carry the greatest genetic variation. This means that many global medical treatments aren't tailored to the people who need them most. But that's beginning to change. Large-scale projects like the African Genome Variation Project are working to map African genetic diversity, helping scientists develop better treatments for diseases like diabetes, hypertension, and even cancer. Studying African DNA doesn't just help Africans, it helps everyone, because understanding the full scope of human genetic variation allows us to unlock new treatments, predict disease risks, and even explore our evolutionary past. Sub-Saharan Africa is the genetic goldmine of humanity. The key to our survival, our history, and even our future lies in the DNA of the world's most ancient and diverse populations. The role of natural selection in African DNA, evolution in action. Africa isn't just the birthplace of humanity. It's also the ultimate testing ground for evolution. For hundreds of thousands of years, natural selection has been shaping African DNA, fine-tuning it for survival in some of the world's most challenging environments. From disease resistance to climate adaptations, the genetic changes seen in African populations are some of the most fascinating examples of evolution in real time. Let's start with one of the biggest evolutionary battles in human history, the fight against malaria. This deadly disease, spread by mosquitoes, has been a constant threat in many parts of Africa for thousands of years. In response, African populations developed a genetic mutation known as the sickle cell trait. People with one copy of the sickle cell gene have natural resistance to malaria, giving them a survival advantage. But there's a catch. Having two copies of this gene causes sickle cell anemia, a serious blood disorder. This is what scientists call a trade-off in evolution, a mutation that provides survival benefit in one situation but causes harm in another. Malaria isn't the only disease that African DNA has evolved to resist. The Duffy-negative mutation, found in many sub-Saharan Africans, provides protection against certain types of malaria parasites. Similarly, genetic adaptations have helped African populations develop resistance to sleeping sickness, a disease spread by the tsetse fly. These mutations show how human DNA is constantly adapting to environmental pressures, ensuring survival against the deadliest threats. But it's not just about disease resistance. African populations have evolved in response to extreme environmental conditions as well. Take high-altitude adaptation in Ethiopian populations, for example. Living in the mountains, where oxygen levels are lower, requires the body to function differently. Unlike people in the Himalayas or the Andes, who adapted through increased hemoglobin production, Ethiopians develop a unique genetic pathway that allows them to thrive without needing extra red blood cells. This shows that even when humans face similar challenges, evolution can take different paths to find solutions. Then there's skin color, one of the most striking examples of human adaptation. The rich melanin in darker skin helps protect against the intense UV radiation near the equator, reducing the risk of skin cancer and preserving essential nutrients like folate. But not all African populations have dark skin. In southern Africa, the Khoisan people have lighter brown skin, showing that skin pigmentation has been evolving in multiple ways for tens of thousands of years. In fact, research has found that some of the genetic variants responsible for light skin in Europeans actually originated in Africa. And what about body shape? The Nilotic people of East Africa, such as the Maasai, are known for their tall, slender physiques, which help dissipate heat in hot climates. Meanwhile, pygmy populations in Central Africa have evolved short stature, which helps them navigate dense rainforests more easily. These differences aren't just about appearance. They're the result of thousands of years of evolutionary fine-tuning. Natural selection is still shaping African DNA today. Studies show that some African populations have unique genetic variants related to metabolism, influencing how they store fat and process food. This could explain why conditions like diabetes and hypertension are more common among people of African descent today, as their bodies evolved to survive in environments very different from the modern world. Despite these groundbreaking discoveries, African populations remain understudied in genetics research. The majority of medical genetic studies focus on European populations, meaning that many life-saving treatments aren't tailored to the people who need them most. But with new projects like the African Genome Variation Project, scientists are finally beginning to unlock the full potential of African DNA. Studying natural selection in Africa isn't just about understanding the past. It's about preparing for the future. The genetic adaptations that helped humans survive in the past could hold the key to tackling modern global challenges, from disease resistance to climate change adaptation. Africa is where humanity began, and it's where evolution continues to shape our species. The story of natural selection in African DNA is a reminder that human survival has always depended on one thing: our ability to adapt. For thousands of years, African populations have faced some of the deadliest diseases on Earth. But instead of being wiped out, their DNA has evolved to fight back, turning their genetic code into a powerful shield against infections. From malaria and sleeping sickness to HIV resistance, African DNA holds the secrets to survival in a world full of microscopic threats. One of the most well-known genetic defenses is the sickle cell trait. Malaria has been one of the biggest killers in Africa for millennia, but some populations develop a mutation that provides natural protection. People who inherit one copy of the sickle cell gene are more resistant to malaria because their red blood cells make it harder for the parasite to survive. However, if someone inherits two copies of the gene, they develop sickle cell anemia, a painful and life-threatening condition. This is an example of a genetic trade-off, where a mutation that helps in one way can cause harm in another. But malaria isn't the only disease African DNA has adapted to fight. The Duffy-negative mutation, found in many sub-Saharan Africans, provides protection against Plasmodium vivax, one of the parasites that causes malaria. This means that people with this genetic trait are practically immune to certain types of the disease. A clear example of evolution at work. Another powerful genetic defense is found in the battle against sleeping sickness, a deadly disease spread by the tsetse fly. Scientists have discovered that some African populations carry unique genetic variants that make them more resistant to this parasite. These adaptations didn't happen overnight. They took thousands of years as human DNA gradually adjusted to the threats of the environment. But not all genetic adaptations in Africa protect against disease. Some actually make people more vulnerable to modern health conditions. For example, African Americans and people of African descent are more likely to develop hypertension and diabetes. One reason for this is a genetic trait that makes some African populations more salt-sensitive. In the past, when food and water were scarce, this helped the body retain essential nutrients. But today, in a world with processed foods and high-sodium diets, it increases the risk of high blood pressure. The same genetic history might also explain why African populations have a higher risk of certain cancers. Some studies suggest that genes that once protected against parasites and infections may now be linked to inflammatory diseases like cancer and autoimmune disorders. This is another example of how evolution never stops. The traits that once helped humans survive can sometimes become disadvantages in changing environments. HIV is another area where African DNA has revealed fascinating insights. Some studies suggest that certain African populations carry genetic variants that slow down the progression of HIV. In fact, scientists studying the immune responses of African individuals have made major breakthroughs in understanding how the body fights the virus. This research has played a critical role in developing better treatments and vaccines that benefit the entire world. Despite these incredible discoveries, African populations remain underrepresented in genetic research. Most medical studies have been conducted on European populations, meaning that many treatments and drugs aren't tailored to people of African descent. But with new projects like the African Genome Variation Project, scientists are finally beginning to close this gap. Studying African DNA isn't just about understanding the past. It's about preparing for the future. The genetic adaptations that helped African populations survive in the past could hold the key to fighting modern pandemics, developing new medicines, and even understanding how human evolution continues today. African DNA is more than just a record of the past. It's a blueprint for survival. The more we study it, the more we learn about the hidden strengths inside all of us. For thousands of years, humans have been on the move. But before there were ships, caravans, or even written history, there were migrations, mass movements of people that shaped the world as we know it today. And at the center of it all, Africa, the land where our species began, is also the stage for some of the most significant migrations in human history. The first and most famous migration was the Out of Africa movement. Around 60,000 to 70,000 years ago, a small group of humans left Africa, eventually populating the rest of the world. But what many people don't realize is that before and after this event, Africa itself was the site of major migrations that transformed its genetic landscape. One of the most impactful was the Bantu migration. About 5,000 years ago, a group of people from the region near present-day Nigeria and Cameroon began expanding across the continent. They brought with them new technologies, agriculture, ironworking, and advanced social structures. Over centuries, they spread across Central, Eastern, and Southern Africa, completely reshaping the continent's genetic and cultural makeup. Today, Bantu-speaking people make up the majority of sub-Saharan Africa, from Kenya to South Africa. But the Bantu weren't the only ones on the move. Afro-Asiatic-speaking groups from North Africa and the Horn of Africa also migrated across the continent, bringing influences from the Nile Valley and the Middle East. These migrations introduced new cultural and genetic influences, shaping populations from Ethiopia to the Sahel. Another major migration involved Nilo-Saharan pastoralists. Around 7,000 years ago, groups from what is now Chad and Sudan moved both westward and eastward. These communities were among the first to domesticate cattle in Africa, and their movement introduced pastoralism to regions that had previously relied on hunting and gathering. Today, populations like the Maasai of Kenya and Tanzania still carry the genetic and cultural legacy of these migrations. And then, there were the more recent migrations. The arrival of Southwest Asians into northern and eastern Africa around 3,000 years ago left genetic traces still visible today. Later, European colonization and the transatlantic slave trade would forcibly displace millions, creating the African diaspora and mixing African DNA with populations across the world. These migrations didn't just change the genetics of Africa, they also changed the world. The spread of African populations meant the spread of genetic adaptations, cultural innovations, and even languages. Today, studying these ancient movements helps scientists understand how humans have evolved and adapted to different environments. The DNA of modern African populations holds the story of these migrations. By analyzing genetic markers, researchers can trace back the movement of entire civilizations, revealing where people came from, who they mixed with, and how their genes influenced future generations. The movement of people is one of the most fundamental forces in human history, and Africa has always been at its heart. Even today, African migrations continue, shaping cities, cultures, and genetic diversity across the world. Understanding this movement doesn't just tell us about the past. It helps us understand the present and even predict the future of human populations. DNA is like a time capsule. Inside it, we carry the genetic memories of our ancestors, traces of where we came from, who we mixed with, and how we survived. But if you truly want to understand the story of human evolution, there's one place you have to look: Sub-Saharan Africa. It's not just the birthplace of modern humans. It's the most genetically diverse region on Earth. But why does that matter? Because in genetics, diversity is everything. It holds the secrets to how humans evolved, adapted, and spread across the planet. Let's go back about 200,000 years. That's when the first Homo sapiens emerged in East Africa. For tens of thousands of years, they remained there, evolving and accumulating genetic diversity. Then, around 60,000 to 70,000 years ago, a small group of humans left Africa and spread to the rest of the world. Here's where things get interesting. When that small group left, they took only a tiny portion of Africa's genetic diversity with them. Over time, as they settled in Europe, Asia, and the Americas, they went through genetic bottlenecks, losing even more diversity along the way. Meanwhile, back in Africa, populations continued to evolve. They adapted to different environments, climates, and diseases, accumulating genetic changes that never made it into non-African populations. That's why two people from Africa are often more genetically different from each other than a European and an Asian person. This diversity isn't just about history, it's about survival. For example, lactase persistence, the ability to digest milk into adulthood, evolved independently in African populations who practiced cattle herding. In Ethiopia, people living at high altitudes have developed unique genetic adaptations to low oxygen levels. And when it comes to disease resistance, African populations have some of the most powerful genetic defenses on the planet. Take sickle cell anemia. The mutation that causes it actually evolved as a defense against malaria. While having two copies of the gene can cause illness, carrying just one makes a person more resistant to malaria, a crucial advantage in regions where the disease is common. Even today, scientists are discovering unknown human ancestors hiding within African DNA. Some populations carry traces of ghost lineages, ancient human groups that interbred with modern humans, but left no direct descendants outside Africa. This is why studying African DNA is crucial for understanding human evolution. It holds the oldest, purest records of our species' journey, data that can help us uncover everything from how humans first evolved to how we might adapt in the future. As genetic research advances, scientists are beginning to fill in the missing pieces of our past. But one thing is clear. If you want to understand humanity, you have to start with Africa. What if your DNA held the secret to superhuman abilities? It might sound like science fiction, but for millions of people in sub-Saharan Africa, genetic adaptations have turned survival into something extraordinary. Over thousands of years, African populations have evolved unique genetic traits that help them thrive in some of the world's most extreme environments. From the blazing heat of the Sahara to the high-altitude peaks of Ethiopia, their DNA has been shaped by nature's toughest challenges. Let's start with something you might not expect: endurance. Some East African populations, like the Nilotic people of Kenya and Sudan, have genetic traits that enhance oxygen efficiency, muscle composition, and heat dissipation. These adaptations make them some of the best long-distance runners in the world. Studies show that their body structure, long limbs, lean muscles, and a high ratio of slow-twitch fibers gives them a natural advantage in endurance sports. But endurance is just the beginning. Sickle cell resistance is another remarkable genetic adaptation. Malaria has been one of the deadliest diseases in African history, killing millions over generations. In response, nature selected for a genetic mutation, the sickle cell trait, which provides protection against malaria. While having 2 copies of the gene can cause sickle cell disease, carrying just 1 copy makes a person far more resistant to malaria. This is one of the clearest examples of evolution in action. Now, let's talk about something even more mysterious: immunity to sleeping sickness. The deadly disease, caused by the tsetse fly, has shaped the genetic makeup of many African populations. Some groups have evolved specific genetic mutations, like the APOL1 gene variants, that help them resist infection. But here's the catch. While these same genetic changes protect against sleeping sickness, they may also increase the risk of kidney disease in African-descended populations. It's a perfect example of evolution's trade-offs. And then, there's skin color. African populations have the widest range of skin tones in the world, from the deepest ebony to lighter brown. This isn't just about beauty, it's about adaptation. The rich melanin in darker skin protects against the sun's intense UV radiation, reducing the risk of skin cancer and preserving essential nutrients like folate, which is crucial for reproduction. In contrast, populations in less sunny regions evolved lighter skin to absorb more vitamin D, showing how human genetics constantly shifts in response to the environment. Even at high altitudes, African DNA holds incredible secrets. While Tibetans and Andean populations evolved adaptations for oxygen processing, Ethiopian highlanders developed a completely different genetic solution. Their DNA allows them to thrive in thin air without the negative side effects seen in other high-altitude populations, proving that evolution can take multiple paths to solve the same problem. These adaptations aren't just relics of the past. They're living proof of how genetics shapes human survival. Understanding them doesn't just teach us about Africa. It helps scientists develop new treatments for diseases, athletic performance, and even space travel. Sub-Saharan DNA isn't just unique. It's a blueprint for human resilience. For centuries, the world has looked at Africa as a land of ancient origins. But what if Africa also holds the key to the future of genetics, medicine, and human evolution? Right now, scientists are on the verge of groundbreaking discoveries, all hidden within the DNA of Africa's diverse populations. But there's a problem. African genomes make up less than 2% of global genetic research. That means the majority of what we know about human genetics is based on European populations, leaving out the world's most diverse gene pool. But that's starting to change. Projects like the African Genome Project and the H3 Africa Initiative are working to decode African DNA on a massive scale. The goal? To revolutionize medicine. Diseases like sickle cell anemia, hypertension, and diabetes disproportionately affect African populations. Yet most treatments are based on data from non-African groups. By studying African genomes, scientists can develop targeted treatments that actually work for the people who need them most. But the impact goes beyond just medicine. African DNA research is also revealing hidden chapters of human history, from uncovering ghost populations, ancient human groups that interbred with early Africans, to mapping forgotten migrations. Genetic studies are rewriting what we thought we knew about human origins. And then, there's the future. What if African DNA holds clues to disease resistance, longevity, or even the ability to adapt to extreme environments? By studying the genetic traits that helped African populations survive for hundreds of thousands of years, scientists could unlock new ways to fight pandemics, slow aging, and even prepare humans for life beyond Earth. But to make this future a reality, representation matters. For too long, African populations have been left out of genetic research, leading to inequalities in healthcare, technology, and even ancestry tracing. The more we invest in African DNA research, the more we unlock discoveries that benefit all of humanity. Africa isn't just the past of human history, it's the future.